Chronic Illness Therapist podcast. This is meant to be a place where people with chronic illnesses can come to feel heard, seen, and safe while listening to mental health therapists and other medical professionals talk about the realities of treating difficult conditions. This might be a new concept for you, one in which you never have to worry about someone inferring that it's all in your head. We dive deep into the human side of treating complex medical conditions and help you find professionals that leave you feeling hopeful for the future. I hope you love what you learn here, and please consider leaving a review or sharing this podcast with someone you love. In this episode, we will hear from Alex, who is actually my neighbor, and she's been living with type 1 diabetes for her whole life, since she was 3. And what I love most about this episode is that it's kind of like a crash course in acceptance and commitment therapy. She talks about mindfulness skills and listening to your body, kind of hearing what your body has to tell you during a low blood sugar moment, a high blood sugar moment. She talks a lot about kind of her rock bottom and what that looked like and how she got out of that place in her life. And throughout the entire episode, it just is really cool to kind of hear how Alex figured out all these different ways to kind of get through these really difficult moments through persevering and creating a community that really works for her. Why don't you start a little bit by maybe telling us kind of your history with type 1 diabetes, what that has been like for you, maybe, just start anywhere that feels good for you.
Okay. Well, I was diagnosed when I was 3 years old. So my mom has 2 older brothers that are both type 1, and she was the one who kind of recognized the signs and the symptoms, and she figured it out. And then they took me to the hospital, and it just confirmed what everybody had already figured out. But it runs pretty strongly in my family, so it hit early for me. And so I'm 33 now. I've been type 1 for 30 years. And not sure. There's so much to it. I don't even know what's relevant.
That's a great starting point. How old you were and kind of how you kind of got that diagnosis, and it sounds like your mom already was familiar with some of the symptoms and signs. What was it like for you growing up then? What did treatment look like? Were you taking insulin? Were you and what was that process like for you? Maybe more, you can talk logistically or emotionally, but I find that the two usually go hand in hand. So
yeah, for sure. So when I was diagnosed, the technology that we had available at the time was not nearly what it is today. And the insulins that we had were much slower. They didn't quite act in the same way. And so when you're type 1, you have to take multiple types of insulin. One of them is sort of an extended release that covers the fasted state, where it's like everything that's happening underneath food, exercise, activity, emotional stuff that can affect your blood sugars, things like that. So at the time, the insulin that I was on, it has this notorious, harsh peak to it. And so if I didn't eat on a schedule, regardless of whether I was hungry or not, I would have horrendous low blood sugars. And low blood sugars, I'll give you a little bit of info on that specific symptoms and stuff. So low blood sugars can come with all these hosts of symptoms and side effects. So one of them is really crazy shakiness and confusion, profuse sweating, sometimes vomiting. These are for severe low blood sugars. And when I was a kid, if I didn't eat on this forced schedule, whether I was hungry or not, I would have horrible low blood sugars. And I have some deep associations with orange juice that will never change. I can't eat oranges or drink orange juice at all now because of that. And it was, I had to be regimented about eating, and I always had to make sure that I had like candies or glucose tablets on me at all times. I mean, I'm right next to I'm in my bed right now, and I have glucose packets right here. Like, they're always within arm's length, no matter what. So that was part of my childhood that obviously was like deeply impactful. And other than my uncles, I was the only person that I knew who had type 1 diabetes. Like, I didn't meet other kids or other people with type 1 until I was like, oh, when did I meet Kat? 5th grade. So I spent most of my early years, like, the freak with needles that all my classmates are like, you're allergic to sugar. And I'm like, you're so wrong. You don't even know how wrong you are, but I'm just going to leave it alone and like let you be wrong. Which is something I've had to like carry through into my life. Like, there's some pretty deep-seated misconceptions about diabetes in the general public that I've given up being upset about, and I've given up fighting, mostly because it's for my own sanity. But, when I was younger, it was always like, I had to fight to advocate for myself, because nobody else knew what they were dealing with or what I was dealing with and how it affected me. Like, I could tell people, oh, my blood sugar is low, but they don't know what that means. They don't know that that's a potentially life-threatening situation that's immediate, So it's one of those things, like, there's no aspect of life that like type 1 doesn't affect. But anyway, back to childhood stuff. So I was like in and out of lows a lot. High blood sugars, the symptoms that they can have is like, you're just so parched, you can't drink enough water. There's no amount of liquid that's going to make that dry mouth and thirst go away. For me, one of the biggest things is I get really ragey when my blood sugar is high. And it's taken me a while to kind of sift through like the physiological things versus the psychological things. And there's a threshold of blood sugar level above which like that irritability is almost like physiologic. It's not that I'm angry because my blood sugar is high, I'm mad that it's high. I'm like irritable and short-tempered and quick to fly off the handle because my brain isn't functioning the way it's supposed to, because it's like swimming in blood sugar. And I can physically feel it when my blood sugar comes back down under a certain level. It's like there's this tightness in my chest that sort of eases. So, when I was a kid, I was this wad of anger and resentment, and I was not like emotionally stable because of it. So I had a lot of problems with like outbursts, and I would get into fights with people a lot, and kind of like swinging back and forth between these like low episodes that leave me like confused and uncomfortable and anxious, and then bouncing back up into high blood sugars where I'm like angry and pissed off about everything. So I just, there was no stability in that. And, because I was so young, like that was just life. I didn't know any better. Man, I wasn't going to get into it this soon in the conversation, but I'll tell you anyway. So I had this moment a couple of years ago. I made some very drastic lifestyle changes, like overhauled everything I was doing, what I ate, who I spent my time with, what I focused on, just like took a complete 180, and I found ways to sort of stabilize my blood sugar. And most of it had to do with food and insulin management. And I had to just overhaul my entire regimen. But once I did that, I found this sort of like profound inner stability that I had never even known existed before. And I remember very clearly, I was sitting at work one day and I was like, oh, I need to check my blood sugar. It's been a minute. So I checked it and it was stable and it was exactly where I wanted it to be. And it hit me that that was the first time in my entire life at like 27 years old that I had experienced that. And it was like somebody slapped me upside the head and I just started crying, like happy tears of just like, oh, I finally found the thing that I didn't even know was missing. And then, of course, I went around to everybody I could possibly find and be like, I found it. And they're like, okay, calm down. It's okay.
No, that's amazing. I love that because one of the things about mental health, about counseling, is that our field has a really bad history of like, change your thoughts, change your life. And when you live with chronic illness or chronic pain, even just anxiety, that's a physiological thing happening in your body. And yes, sometimes your thoughts and your mindset can help calm your nervous system, and it can help get you into a place where then you can go and do the other things that will then further calm your body down. But it sounds like you were fighting yourself all these years because, and I have no doubt you probably had lots of people try to fix you behaviorally.
Sure, yeah. I've been to so many anger management classes, like, I never got like violent with it, but outbursts happen,
Yeah.
But to that point, one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was that I have this sort of like mindfulness practice with my blood sugars. And when I say that, I don't mean just sort of sit still and watch your thoughts like people generally see with mindfulness. It's like there are certain specific thought patterns and trends that I experience during lows and during highs, and they occur before the physical symptoms happen. So if I'm aware of what my thoughts are doing, I can catch a low or catch a high before I hit the point where I'm shaky and dizzy and I feel uncomfortable or something like that. So one thing that I've had to observe but also distance myself from is when I'm low, I have like homicidal thoughts. Like they're not pretty. And if I start getting stuck in this rut of like, I don't like this person, I want to do bad things to them, I'm like, hey, check your blood sugar. I check it. It's almost always low, like without fail. So in that way, I've kind of learned how to like both manage that like emotional state, but also the physical stuff, because I can catch it before it gets physical.
This is so important because a lot of the work that I do with clients is around self-compassion and non-judgment. And that sounds so fluffy, but if you were sitting there judging yourself for the anger and the thoughts that you had, you can't be mindful with it. And then you can't connect the dots. And it's just like, oh, I'm a terrible person because I have these thoughts. And it's like, no, this is a normal response to what happens when your blood sugar is so low that your body could physically die. And so you're going into fight or flight. And what happens in fight or flight? You want to hurt somebody. Like you're fighting for your life.
I fight. I am always a fighter. I've like, I could go into details about that one, but I know for a fact I'm a fight everything and everyone kind of person when I hit that.
And it's clearly kept you alive all these years. And now, I think that's the thing. We are in fight or flight while we have to be. And then when we can finally find some peace and some calm, whether that is by changing like where we are in our environment or changing your diet or changing like these things they're tools that can get us to a place where it sounds like you've gotten yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I really like the tools thing because I find with blood sugar management, it's about having the tools to address what I'm seeing. And one of the things I wanted to include in our conversation today was about how you can have these emotional responses tied up with your success, and I'm putting this in air quotes, as a diabetic. And sidebar, I'm heavily involved in the type 1 online community, but specifically for those people who are either parents of children who are newly diagnosed and adults who are newly diagnosed. And I participate heavily in those two very specific communities at the request of the admins of those forums, because I've been diabetic for so long and I've seen, 30 years of what it's like to live with this stuff. So they've asked me to participate and give my perspective, but also the tools and the knowledge. And it's really easy to fall into this trap of like, oh, my blood sugar's high, I'm a failure. Or, oh, my blood sugar is low, I'm a terrible person. Or, whatever it is. We have these quantifiable metrics that we must pay attention to at all times. And, you're given these guidelines of a very specific range to keep your blood sugars in. And if it's not inside the range you've been given, it's really easy to think that you're failing or that you're a horrible person, you're a bad diabetic, all this stuff. And then that, this is so loaded. There's so many things involved in it, then, you have to go to the endocrinologist every 3 months and submit your blood sugar log for them to look at, and then be judged on whether you're, quote, a good diabetic or not. And that's one of the things that I've really struggled with my whole life is this like deep-seated resentment that I must constantly be scrutinized by an external source that also doesn't have any personal experience with what I am dealing with on a minute-to-minute basis for my entire life. And I find that there's this mindset with the medical professionals where they think they know how to manage diabetes. And because they think they know and they give you guidelines, if you are struggling or you are not achieving success, then you are simply non-compliant with their guidelines, and it's your own fault for struggling, and you're a bad diabetic. And I know you're shaking your head, and I have this like deep well of rage about that I just kind of keep in the corner. It's like,
yeah,
I would like to see somebody else try to do it and have that attitude and maintain it.
It's so unfair to have obviously lived experience. It doesn't always, sometimes you need more, but I think lived experience is the piece to healing. There's a lot of rage here for me as well, where I'm like the medical professionals not listening. And it's why I love functional medicine so much, although that's often very much out of reach for people because it's often not covered by insurance. And so there's a whole bunch of that. But even in the mental health field, it's like all of my clients that have been to therapist after therapist, and I even have quite a few clients who have been in therapy since they were children. And it's always the same message of like, you need to try harder. You're not doing this regimen. You're not practicing this enough. And it's like, but really, because I'm trying everything I can, but it doesn't work in isolation. It takes a team. And so maybe you can speak a little bit to like, what was that turning point for you where you said you overhauled your life, and what supports do you think were in your life at the time that kind of helped you finally make that jump?
Okay. So long-term uncontrolled blood sugars cause nerve damage. They cause microvascular damage. They can cause musculoskeletal problems. They cause every part of your body is damaged by long-term uncontrolled blood sugars. And I'm telling you this because that's integral to what happened and why it changed. So when I was 25 years old, I discovered a spot in my vision and it never went away. And I tried to convince myself for a little while that it was just my contacts. And then I went back to my glasses and I was like, well, it didn't go away. Damn. Okay. Now I have to go to the eye doctor. And so I went to the eye doctor and he diagnosed me with diabetic retinopathy. And what that means is that the blood vessels on your retina have started to break down and leak blood, and that can cause swelling and fluid in your eye. It can cause also the overgrowth of new blood vessels to try to compensate for the damage. So unchecked, this causes blindness. And so I told you that my uncles are type 1. Well, one of my uncles died at 37 from type 1 complications. And I was only 7 when he died, but what I knew of what happened and why was that he had basically gone blind and then slowly become disabled until he had no quality of life and lived in my grandparents' basement until he died. And so I, at 25 years old, learning that I'm starting to go blind, I was like, oh my God, this is the end. I'm going to die just like Uncle Dick in my parents' basement. I'm dead. I'm dying. This is the beginning of dying. Oh my God. And I remember just sitting in the parking lot after that eye appointment, just like hysterical on the phone with my mom. Just like, I'm tearing up talking about it, you know? And I was in deep depression and denial for about a year after that. And man, during that year, I was also in a pretty terrible relationship with somebody who just could not be the support I needed, especially not for that kind of heavy stuff. And I was 25 years old. So like, you know, all my friends, they're like healthy, they're pairing off with other people. They're maybe talking about getting married or like graduating from college. And I'm over here like, I'm about to die. So I was not okay. And kind of think of like how to pare this story down because there's so much to it.
I bet. Yeah. It sounds like ultimately, I mean, we're talking about community and we're talking about like not like going from not having to support to having support. And yeah, there's probably no clear linear connection.
Yeah. I'll say this. I didn't have support at the time because my parents live in Arizona and I live in Georgia. And there's a good like 1,800 miles between us. And my then boyfriend was not only emotionally unavailable most of the time, but also he had a job that had him traveling for half of every week. And then every fourth week, he would be gone for 5 days. So I was both with somebody who was emotionally unavailable and also physically unavailable for more than half the time. And he was the type of partner that did not like when I had friends and hung out with them when he wasn't there. So I really didn't have much at the time, and I felt so alone. And you know, I was struggling with this, you know, existential crisis, basically, of like I'm gonna die like my uncle did, and I'm only 25 years old, and then didn't have anybody, I spent a lot of time on the phone crying with my parents. I also had, the panic attacks that I had during that point in my life were crippling.
I'm sure mixed with blood sugar highs and lows, and like it's all so intermingled. So yeah, it sounds incredibly difficult to manage.
It was, yes. And at the time, so I had previously to that been deeply afraid of needles, which you would think living my entire life with a chronic illness where I'm required to take injections every single day, multiple times a day, I wouldn't have this problem, but that is not true. And I used to have this little device that it was spring loaded, and you would put the syringe into it, and then you could not see the needle. And then you just put it up to your skin, you push a button, it shoots the needle in for you, and then you push the plunger in and you pull it out and everything's fine. So I had one of those my whole life. So I didn't have both the physical and the emotional skills to give myself a shot with a bare needle. And then during this existential crisis period of my life, that device broke. And I proceeded to lose it because without taking my shot, first of all, if I don't take any insulin, I'll end up in the hospital in diabetic ketoacidosis, which is potentially life-threatening. Second of all, I can't eat if I don't take insulin. So, it was like slapped face first with, you're going to have to deal with this, and you're going to have to figure out how to work through this so that you're not literally having a panic attack every time you have to take a shot, because that's like 5 to 8 times a day. And who wants to live with panic attacks that many times a day, right?
Yeah. And was it difficult to get a new device? Is that why you had to switch to needles?
Not difficult, but I can't just go to the store and buy one. I have to order one. And even with overnight shipping, there's still a whole overnight time period where I didn't have it. So what happened was I ordered a new one, and I either broke or lost it 3 times in the space of only a couple of months. And I finally sat down with myself and I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure that this is a universal sign that I need to figure this out.
I love that.
You can't get much clearer than like, hey, do it. So are you familiar with exposure therapy?
Yeah, and it can be incredibly helpful or harmful depending on. So
yes. So in my case, it was extremely helpful because I don't really have a choice in not taking my insulin unless I want to kill myself in a very slow, painful, ugly way. So I was like, okay, how do I get myself through this? And here, I have a syringe right here. I will show you. So I just kind of like familiarized myself with the thing. And I was like,
held it in your hand, you touched it, you looked at it, you just got comfortable with it little by little. And you did this on your own.
Yeah, I did, because I realized I don't have the coping skills to deal with this. I don't know how to handle this for myself, but I do know that I have to be okay with syringes. So how do I be okay with syringes? Well, I mean, you have dogs. I've trained dogs. How do you get dogs to be okay with certain things? It sounds trite, but it's not. It's exposure and positive reinforcement, right? So that's what I did with myself. And I would just like do the hard thing and then be like, oh, I did it. Yeah, I did it. Oh my God. And
I love it.
Yeah. So like after months of doing that, I finally got to the point where I was comfortable with the needle and I could give myself a shot without like panicking, but I would still have to be like, oh, okay, all right, on the count of 3. Okay. And that one took me a long time to get over that part of it too. So anyway, this was like, I'm 32. This is like 8 years ago now. And I'm fine now. I don't even have problems with it, but it took a while. So during all of this extreme emotional growth that I was having to put myself through, because I was faced with like severe complications and disability and a life that I did not want to live, I also finally came around to accepting that I needed to treat the retinopathy that I had been diagnosed with. And so I sought out an ophthalmologist, and the treatment for me was gruesome and panic inducing. They give you injections into your eye.
Oh no.
Yeah.
It does not. Yes, I can even see on your face the memory of like having to go through that. That just, I'm so glad you're able to talk about it right now, because like this does, yeah, that sounds incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it was. So that was traumatic. They ended up having to give me Valium at the eye doctor because I had a panic attack one time and I punched the doctor in the face because she was about to give me injection.
Fight or flight. Like
I told you, I fight. Yeah. So anyway, I was home one day from the eye doctor because they put this medication into the vitreous fluid in your eye, which is sort of like this jelly part between the retina and the lens on the front. So they injected into that, and then there's this sort of cloudiness, and it can take a day or two to resolve. And just because I knew myself and my emotional state around it, I would always just take the whole day off from work, especially because they gave me Valium. And I don't know if you have any experience with Valium, but how to say this? While you're on it, everything's great. When you're coming down off of it, the emotional processing that you should have been doing while experiencing those emotions happens later, but without any of the context for what was happening while it was happening. And given how freaked out and upset and panicked I was about all of it, I would basically like be unable to freak out during, and then I'd freak out later. So I'd take the day off and allow myself to just process everything. I couldn't see out of one eye. I had no depth perception. I was just a hot mess. I was a hot mess. And
you took care of yourself during that time. I think this is another important point, because while it might sound obvious to like, yes, take the day off, so many people continue to work through these really difficult emotions and these difficult situations. And a part of self-care is taking the time for yourself and reducing the shame around not being able, in quotes, to perform or to produce or all of these different things.
Yeah, I was really fortunate at the time that I had a boss who was at least compassionate, and I told her what was going on, and she was just like, I was at work after a treatment one day because I just went back to work after it. This was before they started giving me the Valium, and one eye was dilated like this, and I was like, I'm not okay, but I'm here. And my boss was like, Alex, why are you here? Go. And I was like, I'm sorry, but I have stuff to do. And she was like, do you think that stuff's not still going to be here tomorrow? Get out of my warehouse. Go home. And I was like,
I love it.
Okay. Yeah, she was great. So after that, I was like, I need to take care of myself. Okay. So while I was home during one of those episodes, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. While I was home, I was recovering, and I was on the computer, and I remember very clearly the house I lived in didn't have any heat, and it was the coldest day of the year. And so I was sitting in a chair wrapped in a blanket in front of a space heater with the blanket like over the space heater. So it was like making a tent of warm. And I was on the computer, and I just had this thought kind of come into my head. You know, it didn't feel like my thought. It felt like somebody was telling me something. And it was, I have to figure out a better way, because what I'm experiencing right now is traumatic, and I cannot keep doing this to myself, because every doctor I saw told me that I was going to have to get injections into my eye every month for the rest of my life. And I was like, absolutely not, but with a lot more expletives. Like, no. I just, in my soul, I rejected that. I was like, I will not put myself through that. I can't. There must be a better way, and I have to find it. So I was also experiencing other diabetes complications, specifically very severe digestion problems. And I would wake up in the morning and vomit everything I had eaten the day before that had been undigested in my stomach all night. And this would happen pretty much every day. And if I didn't puke, I'd be so nauseated for the rest of the day that I couldn't even eat. And it obviously affected my blood sugars, because you're supposed to take insulin for your food, but if your food doesn't digest, but the insulin hits your bloodstream, you get severe lows and then crazy highs later. And like I said, I was a hot mess. So,
well,
anyway,
your illness was a hot mess. You seem to be figuring it out like a champ.
Yes, you're right. Now, okay, I'm going to come back to my story for a second. I like the way that you said that, because over this process, one of the things that I realized is that with this type of chronic illness, if you ignore it, it gets loud and louder and louder and louder and louder until you are forced to pay attention to it. And sometimes that can mean you land yourself in the emergency room. And sometimes it can mean that you have a public episode of mania where you end up in the back of a cop car, because that's happened to me with a severe low blood sugar before. And, you know, you cannot ignore it, because it will not be ignored. And it's an unfortunate thing that, how do you accept that? You know what I mean? If all you ever want is for this to go away, but the way to make it go away is to pay attention to it, like, whoa, that's going to screw with your head, right? And one of the things I've learned as I've come through out the other side of this like deep hole I had found myself in is that you have to kind of like pay attention to the wellness of your future self. And in order to take care of myself tomorrow, I have to take steps today to make that happen. So back to how the changes happened. So while I'm on the computer and I'm desperately trying to find anything I possibly can, I kid you not, I'm not exaggerating, I sat in front of that computer for 24 hours straight. I didn't do anything but eat and pee and then go right back to my chair. And I looked through every Google search, every internet forum I could find. I was on Reddit. I was on all the diabetes forums. I was on Facebook, everything that I could possibly find. And I found some horrifying things where I was like, oh, nope, can't look at that. And I found a few little like breadcrumb nuggets. And then I stumbled across a blog from a doctor who is himself type 1 and also an athlete. And he had started experimenting with a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet for athletic performance, but then discovered that it helped with his diabetes. So he wrote an ebook And I downloaded that immediately and I read it and I was like, this is counter to every single thing I've ever been told. There must be something to this, because if everything I've ever been told right now is what I feel like I need to reject in order to find my way to success, then okay, what's this all about? And then after I read the ebook, by the way, that doctor's name is Keith Runyon, for context.
And so, does he still produce, I'm curious if he still produces information and people can go find this if they're looking for that?
He has a blog. I don't remember off the top of my head what it's called, but I can send it to you and you can put it in the show notes.
Great, yeah.
Cool. So the next reference I have for you is this one line that was in that book. And this is the book that changed my life. And it's called The Diabetes Solution by Dr. Richard K. Bernstein. And this book is like the encyclopedia of how to manage your blood sugars, right? And I went on his website, I read his biography, and he is, I think at this point, he's like 86 or so. And he was diagnosed when he was, I want to say, a teenager. And his blood sugars were just wildly out of control. And, you know, he was by the time he was a young adult, just like me, he was experiencing complications. And, you know, he had a wife and children, and his low blood sugar episodes were so severe for him that they were affecting his relationships with his family and his children and his work and all this stuff. And so same thing for him. He was like, I have to figure out what to do. I'm dying and I need to do something different. So what he did, his wife was a physician. And because she was a physician, she could order medical equipment. And at the time, this was, I want to say like 50 years ago. So at the time, at-home blood glucose monitoring did not exist. You could only get your blood glucose checked at the doctor or at the hospital. Otherwise, you had to do a urine test where you had to sort of like do a little chemistry and like put urine in a vial and add stuff to it, and it would change color, and that would tell you how much how much glucose was in your urine, which is a very inefficient way of doing that.
I would say,
but,
yeah.
Probably I could get into the
you can't just like
but
eat something and then pee, and like that's, whereas like now you can take your blood sugar, and I'm sure it's a much shorter time between eating and checking.
Oh, now I have a sensor on my arm and I wave my phone over it and it tells me what my blood sugar is.
I love that.
I know, right? It's great. So anyway, long story short, he gets this device that's meant to be for emergency rooms to test people's blood sugars to find out whether they were unconscious from low blood sugar or whether they were just drunk, because the outward symptoms of those two things are very similar. So he gets that. He's an engineer by trade. And so he starts collecting data points on his blood sugar and monitoring them. And he starts adjusting his insulin and his food based on the data points that he's getting from his blood sugar meter. And throughout this testing and experimenting process, he developed methods for how to manage your blood sugars. And then he went to his doctor about it, and his doctor was like, what? No, why would we do that? Like, then my patients wouldn't come to me for help. Right. I see you covering your face. I agree. Yes. So unfortunately, that attitude is still very prevalent today in the Diabetes Society. So anyway, long story short, this biography deeply resonated with me. And I bought this man's book. I ordered it overnight. I took the next day off from work, even though I had already taken a day before. And I sat there and I waited for UPS on the porch. And I got this book, and this book is fat. It's like 1,000 pages of how to manage your blood sugars. And I read it cover to cover in like a day and a half. And it blew my mind, because I in the 20 some odd years of being diabetic at the time, I had never heard any of this information from anyone. And the first thing that happened was I got just infuriated because I was like, you were willing to let me die when this information was available. Oh, what?
Yeah.
Oh, so.
And I think what I'm hearing throughout the thread of your story is that you didn't have like support in the people around you, but you found ways to support yourself through this. And part of that was taking time. You allowed yourself time off from work. You used the computer that you had to not just research and go down anxiety rabbit holes, which, hey, maybe you've done that too, because I think we all have at some point or another, but you actually use that time to find something that was going to help. And then it just sounds like piece by piece, the book, the blogs, the new information allowed you to start like putting the puzzle pieces together and building the support that you have now.
Yeah, totally. And you're right. I remember clearly having to come to a realization that I was not going to find the support that I needed. So if I needed it, where could I find it? I have to find it for myself. And, if I'm the only one that I can rely on for that, well, okay, cool. I don't know how to do that, but I'm going to figure it out. And that's what I did. And, since then, just slowly and incrementally, I have built the support system around myself that I do need. And, I've cultivated relationships and sought out information and all the things that I did actually need. But I had to hit that low point of realizing I don't have what I need. And now what? Now what do I do? Find it. Go find it. Because I am the type of person that I want actionable solutions for the things that I find challenging. And, type 1 diabetes is deeply challenging. Okay, so if everything I think I know isn't working, well, now it's time to go find what can work, right? And so I found this book, and it was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done for myself that has been the most rewarding, because I had to unlearn everything I thought I knew. I had to accept that I was really sick and that I wasn't healthy, and I couldn't pretend like I was okay anymore, and I had to allow myself to not be okay. And then I had to figure out how to apply all of these tools for management of my blood sugars and my diabetes so that I could be okay. But I had to be okay with not being okay for a while. And it took 2 years to really like adapt and understand what to do and how to do it and when to do it and what to eat and how to take my insulin. And, that kind of tinkering never ends, but, unlearning everything that you thought was gospel about managing your health and then finding this whole new thing, like sometimes the cognitive dissonance is painful. And
yes, I think it keeps a lot of us stuck, and we kind of get into the shame spiral of like blaming ourselves. But cognitive dissonance it's incredibly difficult to navigate. And I'm curious, as we kind of come up to the end here, I feel like you've shared so much about kind of how you again navigated seriously just the most difficult of situations. You mentioned that you're in parent support, or you're in like groups that are geared towards like helping parents support their kids. And I'm curious I'm sure you've got lots of logistical advice to like find this doctor or do this thing, but do you have some emotional, what can parents do either for themselves or to support their kids in dealing with the emotions that come along with this illness?
That question comes up a lot, and I don't have any cut and dry answers for it. but the biggest things in my support network that I lean on are my people. And by my people, I mean, my partner, my parents, my friends, my circle, my people, not telling me what I should or shouldn't be doing. Don't wag your finger at me. Tell me that I hear you and I know you're struggling. I know that you will come through this and it will be okay. And one thing that I have with both my parents and my best friend is, do you want advice or do you want me to listen? And I love that because sometimes I just want to pop off, and sometimes I do need advice, but most of the time I don't need nuts and bolt advice. I have the nuts and bolt tools that I need. So what I really need is for you to just let me blow off some steam and be upset about it for a minute, and then I'll be okay. Or, it's very rare now, but on the rare occasion where I have a breakdown where I got to cry about it, it's probably better if you just let me cry and don't say anything. You can't make that better. So what you can do is be present and acknowledge that this is how I feel, and I think for kids, it's so heartbreaking. We want to take the pain away for our kids, but we can't. And we want desperately to give them everything to make them happy and healthy and successful. And this chronic illness comes along and it's like, nope. And so what do, right? So you teach them the nuts and bolts of how to manage their disease to the best of their abilities within their capability and within the framework of the lifestyle that they want. And you just allow them to feel however it is. Now, I will say this, hearkening back to the beginning of our conversation where I was talking about that sort of ragey feeling with highs. One thing I think is really important is to recognize that because our blood sugars can create emotional side effects, this is a twofold thing. One, don't react to it. And by that, I mean, if your kid's upset and spouting off with a mouse, don't spout back at them.
Don't punish them. Don't tell them how wrong they are, how disrespectful they're being. Maybe you can have a conversation about it later in a loving and conversational way, but just condemning them for that reaction does no one any good. And it actually exacerbates the problem.
Yes. And what else exacerbates the problem is in the middle of being upset about something, if you ask a diabetic, have you checked your blood sugar right now?
Oh, no. It's like telling someone.
Probably right.
I bet it's like telling someone to take a deep breath. Calm down. Just take a deep breath. You're about to get punched.
Totally. I've spouted go F yourself at quite a few people for that. Just I know that you're right, but I don't like that you're right.
Yeah, that's not the time. It really isn't the time. In fact, the time is it doesn't really matter if I go check it. What the emotion is here.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yes.
It's here. So let's just let it blow over.
Right. Totally. But, to that vein, I know you asked me about what advice I give to kids, but something that I have learned with myself is that I am well aware of how my emotions are affected by my blood sugars. And I have learned over time that the very best thing I can do for myself and my relationships with other people is to just keep my mouth shut and keep it to myself, because it's transitory and it doesn't matter that I'm ragey in that moment. I cannot make it somebody else's problem. but I can accept that, this is how I feel right now, and I can't change the fact that I feel this way, but I can't take it out on everybody else. So I just need to be quiet and keep it to myself and give myself time to be okay until I am okay. And that one takes maturity.
It does, but it's perfect advice. And it actually is what I would say to a parent if I were working with a parent on this. As parents, we model behaviors to our kids. And so if you can be silent and calm while they're raging, you are not telling them that this behavior is always okay for the rest of your life and you can do this whenever you want. That's what parents think. But your quietness and your stillness actually teaches them, this is what we do when we have these emotions. We calm ourselves, we center ourselves, and we wait for it to pass. So I think it's beautiful advice.
Totally. I do this with my stepdaughter. She struggles with anger management stuff as well. And I feel perfectly qualified to help her with this one because I've dealt with this my whole life. And one thing with her that I do is, if I recognize that she's getting overwhelmed and upset, I'll ask her, do you need a minute? Do you need to go to your room? Do you want me to leave you alone? Because if you do need that, take it. And 9.9 times out of 10, the answer is yes. And she goes away for a minute and she can collect herself and then she can come back and she's cool. But I can't be upset that she's upset, because then we end up in this feedback loop. Basically.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Alex, thank you so much for sharing all of your story. I feel like people are really going to get a lot out of this. The emotional ride is something that is really hard to put into words. And so to hear someone else's personal story and some of these really specific examples it's just really helpful. So I really appreciate it.
I do too. I'd like to close with, I have come out of all of that struggle and distress that I was in and found that stability, and I know how to come back to that. So life now is, I could not have even conceived of it at the beginning. I still have a chronic illness that will never change, but I am not in that deep well of all the things that were digging me down into it anymore. And that's one of the takeaways that I wanted to bring to.
Yeah, I think again, that's so important, because we often just hear about like how we got over it. And so in your story, we're hearing what the struggle looked like while you were working through it. And that's just so helpful.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you.
If you learned something new today, consider writing it down in your phone notes or journal and make that new neural pathway light up. Better yet, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a DM on Instagram, email me, or leave a voice memo for us to play on the next show. The way you summarize your takeaways can be the perfect little soundbite that someone else might need in order to better absorb the same lesson. Lastly, leaving a review really helps others find this podcast, so please do so if you found this episode helpful.